The night I almost died wasn't the night that changed me. It was the night I realized I didn't care if I lived. The city stretched beneath my penthouse windows like it belonged to me, every light flickering against the glass like a silent promise I had already collected. But standing there with a glass of bourbon I hadn't touched, I felt nothing, not pride, not power, not even the hollow satisfaction that used to come with control, just silence, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my chest like something I couldn't outrun, something I couldn't buy. And for the first time in years, I noticed it, the absence, the emptiness, the part of me that had disappeared so quietly I hadn't even realized it was gone. Until that night when everything should have mattered and didn't, when the air still carried the faint smell of rain from earlier, and my suit jacket hung over the chair like it belonged to someone else, someone who still felt things, someone who still had a reason to stand here looking out at a city that never slept. Because I hadn't slept either, not really, not in months, maybe years. Not the kind of sleep that leaves you whole, just the kind that lets your body shut down while your mind keeps counting, calculating, planning, always moving, always watching, always one step ahead, until even that started to feel pointless, until every victory blurred into the next, and every deal sounded the same. Voices, numbers, signatures, all blending into a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt empty from within. And I remember thinking, not dramatically, not like in the movies, just quietly, almost casually, that if it all ended right then, it wouldn't make a difference, not to me, maybe not to anyone. And that thought should have scared me, but it didn't. That was the problem. The fear was gone, replaced by something colder, something detached, something that made everything else feel distant, like I was watching my own life from behind glass, untouchable and untouched at the same time. And I set the glass down without taking a sip, the ice already melting, already losing shape, and I wondered when I had started doing that, when I had started leaving. Things unfinished, conversations, drinks, people, like nothing was worth the full effort anymore, like nothing could hold my attention long enough to matter, and the silence stretched again, deeper this time, filling the space where something used to live, something human, something I couldn't name anymore. And I turned away from the window, because even the view had lost its meaning. Even the city that once felt like mine now looked like just another place, just another collection of lights and buildings that existed whether I cared or not. And maybe that was the truth I had been avoiding all along, that none of it needed me, that I had built something powerful, but not something real, and standing there alone, in a room too big and too quiet, I realized I had everything I thought I wanted and absolutely no idea what to do with it. I left the lights off that night, which was unusual for me, because I had always preferred to see everything clearly, every corner, every reflection, every shadow accounted for. But in the dark, the silence felt louder, more honest somehow, like it was not pretending to be anything else, and I sat there longer than I should have, staring at nothing, listening to the faint hum of the city 30 floors below, until even that became too much, until I needed movement, something real, something immediate. So I grabbed my keys without thinking, no destination, no plan, just the need to get out of a place that suddenly felt like a museum of a life I no longer recognized. And the elevator ride down felt longer than usual, each floor lighting up slowly, mechanically, like time itself was dragging its feet. And when the doors finally opened, the cool night air hit me in a way that made me pause, sharp and grounding, like it was reminding me that I was still here, still breathing, even if I did not feel alive. And I walked without direction, hands in my pockets, past storefronts closing for the night, past people who did not notice me, which was new, because people usually noticed. They usually stepped aside, lowered their voices, changed their posture. But here, in this part of the city, I was just another man in a dark coat walking under flickering streetlights. And there was something strangely unsettling about that, something unfamiliar, until I found myself stopping in front of a small diner I had never noticed before, the kind of place that did not belong in my world, with a neon sign buzzing softly and windows fogged from the warmth inside. And I do not know why I went in, maybe because it was open, maybe because it looked real, or maybe because for once, I wanted to be somewhere that did not know my name. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, and the smell of coffee and something sweet wrapped around me instantly, simple, comforting, Nothing like the expensive places I usually occupied, and I hesitated for a second, like I was not sure I belonged there, before sliding into a booth near the window. The leather seat worn but clean, the table scratched in a way that told stories no one bothered to erase, and I sat there, not reaching for a menu, not checking my phone, just existing in a space that did not expect anything from me. And then I heard her voice, soft but steady, not rushed, not forced. "Long night?" she asked, and I looked up, really looked, for the first time in what felt like forever, and she was just a waitress, nothing extravagant, no designer clothes, no calculated smile, just tired eyes that somehow still held warmth, like she had every reason to be exhausted but chose not to be. And for a second, I did not answer, because I was not used to being asked simple questions like that, not without an agenda behind them, not without someone wanting something in return. But there was none of that in her expression, just quiet curiosity, and I found myself responding before I could stop it. "Something like that," I said, my voice lower than usual, less controlled, and she nodded like she understood more than I had said, placing a cup of coffee in front of me without asking, like it was obvious I needed it. And I watched the steam rise between us, curling into the air, something so small and ordinary. And yet I could not remember the last time anything felt this uncomplicated. And when she turned to leave, she paused just slightly, glancing back at me with a faint smile. That did not try to impress, did not try to charm, it just existed. And that was when I noticed it, the shift, subtle but undeniable, something inside me reacting, not power, not control, something quieter, something unfamiliar. And as the door chimed again behind another late-night customer, I realized I had not thought about the emptiness for several seconds, which was longer than it had been gone in a very long time. I stayed longer than I intended, long after the coffee had gone from hot to warm to something I drank without noticing. And she moved through the diner with a quiet rhythm that felt different from the rest of the world, steady and unforced, like she was not trying to impress anyone, not trying to be anything other than exactly who she was. And I found myself watching her in a way that had nothing to do with control or calculation, just observation, simple and unfamiliar, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she thought no one was looking, the way she thanked customers even when they barely acknowledged her, the way she carried tiredness like it was part of her but not something that defined her. And it did not make sense to me why any of that mattered, why I noticed details that I would have dismissed anywhere else. But I did. And when she came back to my table, refilling the cup I had not asked to be refilled, she tilted her head slightly, studying me with that same quiet curiosity. "You do not look like someone who belongs here," she said, not accusing, not impressed, just stating something she observed. And I almost smiled at that, because she was right, and people usually knew it immediately but reacted differently, with caution, with respect, sometimes with fear, but she did none of those things. She just said it, like it was a simple fact, and I leaned back slightly, letting the moment stretch instead of cutting it short the way I usually would. "And where do I belong?" I asked, my voice softer than it had been in years, and she shrugged lightly, a small, almost careless motion that somehow felt honest. "Somewhere louder," she said, glancing around the diner as if comparing it to a place she could not see. "Somewhere people are trying harder." And I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, because she had described my world in a way no one ever had, not with admiration, not with envy, just distance, like it was something exhausting to even imagine, and that should have annoyed me. But it did not. It did the opposite. It slowed something down inside me, something that had been running for too long, and I found myself asking a question I had no reason to ask. "And you? Do you belong here?" And she smiled then, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to soften the tiredness in her eyes. "For now," she said, wiping the edge of the table with a cloth that had probably seen too many long nights like this one. "It pays the bills, and it is quiet after midnight." And there was something in the way she said quiet that made me understand it was not just about noise. It was about space, about breathing, about surviving in a world that did not always make it easy. And I nodded slowly, like I understood more than I could explain, because I did, in a different way, in a way she could not see. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the diner humming softly around us, the clock on the wall ticking past 2 in the morning, and I realized I was not thinking about leaving, not checking the time, not reaching for my phone, just sitting there in a place that should have meant nothing to me and somehow did. And when she stepped away again to take another order, I watched her go with a strange awareness settling in, something quiet but persistent, like a thought I could not quite catch. And I looked down at the cup in front of me, at the faint reflection of my own face in the dark surface of the coffee. And for the first time in a long time, I did not look like someone in control. I looked like someone searching. And I did not know if that was a problem or the beginning of something I had been missing for longer than I wanted to admit. The bell above the door rang again, softer this time, like the night itself was beginning to slow down, and I did not turn to look. Because for once I was not tracking every movement around me, not measuring risk, not calculating outcomes, just sitting there with my hands loosely wrapped around a cup that had already cooled, and it felt strange, almost unfamiliar, to exist without purpose, without urgency, like I had stepped outside of my own life for a moment and was watching it from a distance. And when she came back, she did not rush, did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply leaned one hand against the edge of the booth across from me, not sitting, just pausing, like she had decided I was worth a few extra seconds of her time. "You have been staring at that coffee like it owes you something," she said, her tone light but observant, and I glanced down at the dark surface again before meeting her eyes. "Maybe it does," I replied, and she gave a quiet huff of amusement, not quite a laugh, just enough to shift the air between us. "Coffee does not owe anyone anything," she said, straightening slightly. "It just does its job and hopes people appreciate it." And there was something in that sentence that lingered longer than it should have, something simple but grounded, like a rule I had forgotten existed, and I found myself asking, "And what about people?" And she hesitated for a fraction of a second, not caught off guard, just choosing her words carefully. "People expect too much," she said finally, her voice softer now, less casual. "That is usually where things go wrong," and I leaned back, studying her in a way that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with understanding, because she spoke like someone who had learned that lesson the hard way, and I recognized that tone even if our worlds were nothing alike, and I nodded slowly. "That sounds like experience," I said, and she gave a small shrug, the kind that dismissed more than it revealed. "Everyone has some," she replied, before glancing toward the counter as another order came up, but she did not move. Right away, and that pause, that decision to stay a second longer, felt heavier than it should have, like it meant something neither of us was saying, and I realized then that no one stayed with me without a reason, without expecting something in return, except her. She stayed because she chose to, and that difference settled somewhere deep, somewhere I had not felt in a long time. And when she finally turned to leave, I spoke before I could stop myself. "What is your name?" And she looked back over her shoulder, a faint smile touching her lips. "Emily," she said, simple, unguarded, and for a moment, the name felt like more than just a word, like it carried something real in a world that had started to feel artificial, and I repeated it quietly, almost to myself. "Emily." And she nodded once before disappearing behind the counter, leaving me alone again, but not in the same way as before, because the silence did not press as hard. It did not feel as empty. It felt lighter, and I sat there longer than I should have, long enough for the clock to edge closer to 3 in the morning, long enough for the diner to grow quieter, until eventually I stood, reaching into my pocket out of habit before stopping halfway through the motion, because for the first time, I did not want to reduce this moment to something transactional, did not want to leave it behind like everything else, and instead I placed enough cash on the table to cover more than the bill and stepped toward the door, pausing just briefly as I glanced back, catching a glimpse of her behind the counter, laughing softly at something another worker said. And it struck me then, unexpectedly and without warning, that I did not want this to be the only night I saw her. And that thought followed me out into the cool air, steady and persistent, like the beginning of something I had not planned and could not control. I told myself I would not come back. That one quiet night in a place that did not belong to me did not mean anything, that it was just a moment, something temporary, something I could leave behind the same way I left everything else. But the next night, when the city fell into that same restless rhythm and the silence returned, heavier than before, I found myself reaching for my keys without thinking again, like my body had already made the decision before my mind could argue with it. And the Drive felt shorter this time, the turns more familiar, even though I had only been there once. And when I saw the soft glow of that flickering neon sign, something in my chest shifted, subtle but undeniable, like recognition, like expectation, and I almost laughed at myself for it. Because I did not do expectation, I did not wait for things, I made them happen, I controlled them. But this was different. This was something I could not name, and when I stepped inside, the bell chimed again, the same soft sound as before, and the warmth wrapped around me like it had been waiting, like nothing had changed, and yet everything felt slightly different, sharper, more present, and I caught sight of her almost immediately, behind the counter this time, pouring coffee into a chipped mug, her movements just as steady, just as unhurried, and when her eyes lifted and found mine, there was a brief flicker of recognition, not surprise, not excitement, just acknowledgement, like she had expected me to exist again but had not built anything around it. And she gave a small nod, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips before she turned back to what she was doing. And I realized then that she was not going to treat me differently just because I came back. She was not going to give me special attention or read into it. And that grounded me in a way I did not expect, because it meant this place, this moment, was not about who I was outside these walls. It was just about being here, and I slid into the same booth as the night before, the worn leather creaking softly beneath me. And for a second, I noticed how natural it felt, like I had done this 100 times instead of once. And she approached after a minute, setting the same cup down in front of me without asking. "You came back," she said, not as a question, just a quiet observation, and I nodded slightly. "It was open," I replied, and she tilted her head just enough to show she heard the answer, but did not entirely believe it. "There are a lot of places open at this hour," she said, her tone light but knowing, and I met her gaze, holding it for a second longer than necessary. "Not like this one," I said. And something in her expression softened, just slightly, like she understood more than I had said, but chose not to push it further, and she leaned back against the booth for a moment, crossing her arms loosely. "So, what is it tonight?" she asked. "Another long night, or just avoiding sleep?" And the question hit closer than it should have, closer than anyone had gotten in a long time, and I let out a slow breath, the kind that felt like it carried more weight than air. "Maybe both," I said. And she nodded again, like that answer made sense to her, like it fit into something she already knew. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence settling between us in a way that felt comfortable instead of heavy. And I realized that the emptiness I had been carrying had shifted, not gone, not fixed, but quieter, less demanding, like it had stepped back just enough to let something else exist in its place. And I did not know what that something was yet, but I knew where it started. Right here, in a place that did not ask for anything, with a girl who did not try to take anything. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to leave. It became a pattern before I admitted it was one, the way my nights started to bend around that place, the way meetings ended earlier than they used to, the way I found reasons to be on that side of the city when the clock edged past midnight. And I told myself it was temporary, just something to fill the hours, just something to quiet the noise. But patterns do not form without purpose, and this one settled in quietly, like it had always been there waiting, and each time I walked through that door, the bell sounded less like an interruption and more like a signal that something steady still existed, something unchanged, and Emily never reacted the way others did when they began to expect someone. She did not brighten too much, did not ask why I kept coming back. She just adjusted, like my presence was another detail in the room, another part of the rhythm. And that consistency did something to me, something I had not felt in a long time, because in my world, everything shifted constantly, loyalty, alliances, even silence had meaning. But here, it was just simple, just real, and one night, as I sat across from her while she took a short break, a cup of coffee resting between her hands instead of mine, she studied me a little longer than usual, not in a way that felt invasive, just thoughtful, like she was piecing together something she had not fully decided on yet. "You still have not told me what you do," she said, her tone light but deliberate. And I leaned back slightly, feeling the weight of that question in a way I had not expected, because it was simple, but the answer was not in a way that fit into this place, not in a way that would leave things unchanged. And for a second, I considered deflecting, giving her something vague, something safe, but she held my gaze without pressure, without expectation, just waiting, and that made it harder to lie. Not because she demanded honesty, but because she did not need it, and I exhaled slowly, choosing something in between. I handle problems, I said, the words measured, controlled, but stripped of detail, and she raised an eyebrow slightly, a hint of amusement touching her expression. That sounds vague on purpose, she replied, and I almost smiled, because she was right again. It is, I admitted, and she nodded like she accepted that boundary without needing to push past it, which was rare. People either demanded more or assumed the worst, but she did neither. She simply took the answer as it was and let it sit, and after a moment, she shifted her attention to her coffee, tracing the rim of the cup with her finger absent-mindedly. "You do not seem like someone who belongs to problems," she said quietly, almost like she was thinking out loud, and I watched her, the way she said it without judgment, without accusation, just observation, and something in my chest tightened, not discomfort, not quite, something closer to recognition, like she had seen a version of me I had buried a long time ago, and I let out a breath, slower this time. "Neither do you," I replied, and she smiled faintly, but there was something behind it, something tired, something that suggested. Her world was not as simple as it looked from across this table. "Maybe that is why I stay here," she said, glancing around the diner. "It is easier to pretend for a few hours," and the honesty in that sentence lingered between us, heavier than anything we had said before, and I realized then that this was not just about quiet nights or simple conversations. This was something deeper, something that existed in the space between who we were and who we allowed ourselves to be here. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if those two versions ever collided, if the world I came from ever reached into this one. And the thought did not feel like a question. It felt like a warning, quiet but certain. And as Emily stood to go back to work, brushing her hands against her jeans like she was shaking off something unseen, I watched her move away and understood something I had been avoiding. This was no longer just a place I came to escape. It was becoming something I did not want to lose. It did not happen all at once. The shift, it never does. It moved in small ways, almost invisible at first, like the way I started leaving my phone face down on the table instead of within reach, like the way I stopped checking the time every few minutes, like the way conversations with her stretched longer without effort, without that quiet pressure to control where they were going. And somewhere in between those moments, something else began to change, something outside of this place. Something that did not belong to late-night coffee or soft voices or worn leather booths. And I noticed it the first time I ignored a call I would have answered without hesitation before, the screen lighting up briefly before going dark again. And I let it disappear without answering, without reacting, without the usual instinct to respond immediately. And that should have felt wrong. It should have felt like losing control. But instead, it felt quiet, like choosing something else. For once, and Emily noticed, not the call itself, but the hesitation, the way my attention flickered and then settled again. "You are different tonight," she said as she set down a fresh cup, her eyes studying me in that same steady way that always felt like she was seeing more than I said. And I leaned back slightly, considering the statement instead of deflecting it. "Different how?" I asked, and she shrugged lightly, but her gaze did not leave mine. "Less somewhere else," she said, and I let out a slow breath, because that was exactly it. Less divided, less pulled in a dozen directions at once, less controlled by things I used to think defined me, and I nodded once. "Maybe I am," I said, and she smiled faintly, like that answer was enough, like she did not need an explanation to understand it. And for a moment, the world outside this place felt distant, not gone, but muted, like it had stepped back just enough to let something else take its place. And then the door opened again, the bell chiming sharper this time, and I felt it immediately. Not fear, not even tension, just awareness, the kind that had been trained into me over years, the kind that never fully disappears. And I did not turn right away, but I did notice the shift, the subtle change in the air, the way my attention sharpened without permission. And Emily followed my gaze instinctively, glancing toward the entrance before looking back at me, her expression unchanged but her voice quieter. "You know them?" she asked, and I shook my head slightly, not because I did not recognize the type, but because I refused to let that world step fully into this one. Not yet. Not here. Just passing through, I said, the words more for myself than for her. And she studied me for a second longer, like she was deciding whether to believe that, before nodding once and letting it go. And that was the moment I realized something I had not allowed myself to admit before. This place was no longer just separate from my world. It was something I was trying to protect from it, something I did not want touched by the same rules, the same expectations, the same weight that followed me everywhere else. And that thought settled deeper than anything else had, because it meant there was something here worth protecting, something real enough to matter. And as Emily turned to take another order, moving through the diner with that same steady rhythm, I watched her and understood, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the shift clearly now. The line between the two worlds was getting thinner, and sooner or later, it would not be a line at all, it would be a choice. The moment did not arrive with noise or chaos or anything dramatic enough to warn me. It came quietly, the way most things that matter do, and I felt it before I understood it. The shift in the air when Emily stepped outside for her break, the way the door closed behind her with a softer sound than usual, and I watched through the window as she leaned against the side of the building, arms crossed loosely against the cold, her breath visible in the night air, steady and calm, like she had carved out this small piece of silence for herself in a world that rarely slowed down. And something pulled at me then, not instinct, not obligation, just a simple decision. And I stood, leaving the booth without overthinking it, pushing the door open and stepping into the cool air that felt sharper than before, more present. And she glanced up when she heard me, a hint of surprise flickering across her face before settling into something softer. "You do not look like someone who takes breaks," she said, her voice quiet but steady, and I leaned back against the wall a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising my voice, but not close enough to crowd her space. "Maybe I am learning," I replied, and she smiled faintly, the kind that did not demand attention but stayed with you anyway. And for a moment we stood there in silence, not awkward, not forced, just shared, the kind of silence that did not need to be filled. And I realized how rare that was, how unfamiliar it used to feel, and how natural it had become. And she glanced down at her hands for a second before speaking again. "You ever feel like you are living two different lives?" she asked, her tone casual, but the question anything but. And I let out a slow breath, because she had said it so simply, the exact thing I had been avoiding naming, and I nodded once. "All the time," I said, and she looked at me then, really looked like she was trying to see where those two lives existed in me. And for a second, I wondered what she would find if she saw everything, not just this version of me standing here in the cold night air, but the other one, the one that built walls instead of stepping outside them, the one that did not hesitate, did not question, did not stay in places like this longer than necessary. And the thought tightened something in my chest, not fear, not exactly, something closer to reluctance, like I did not want those two versions to collide. Not here, not with her. And she exhaled softly, her breath drifting into the night. "I think one of them is real," she said, almost to herself, "and the other one is just what you needed to survive." And the words settled heavier than anything else she had said before, because they were not directed at me, but they fit anyway, too well, like they had been waiting for me to hear them. And I looked at her, really looked this time, and realized something I had not allowed myself to before. She was not just part of a place I came to escape. She was part of the reason it felt real. And that realization came with something else, something sharper, the understanding that this could not stay separate forever, that the world I came from would eventually find its way here, whether I wanted it to or not. And as if the thought itself had weight, the door behind us opened again, the bell cutting through the quiet night, and I felt it immediately, that familiar awareness snapping back into place, not overwhelming, but present. And Emily noticed the change, the way my posture shifted slightly, the way my attention sharpened, and she followed my gaze toward the door before looking back at me, her expression more serious now. "That is one of those lives, is it not?" she asked, and for a moment, I considered denying it, keeping the separation intact just a little longer. But the truth sat too close to the surface, and I nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Yes," I said, and the word felt heavier than it should have, because it was not just an answer, It was the beginning of something I could not take back, and as the night air pressed in around us and the quiet between us shifted into something more uncertain, I understood that the line I had been trying to hold was already starting to break, and this time, it would not be something I could control. The air did not feel the same after that, not outside, not inside, not even in the space between us, and I could see it in the way Emily held my gaze a second longer than before, not afraid, not even hesitant, just aware now, aware that there was something more behind the version of me she had been talking to, something that did not fit into late-night conversations and quiet coffee breaks, and I felt it too. The weight of that awareness settling in, changing the shape of everything without breaking it completely. Not yet. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching in a way that was no longer simple, no longer easy, but not entirely uncomfortable either, just different, like a line had been drawn that neither of us fully understood. And I realized then that this was the moment I could step back, the moment I could let this remain what it had been, something separate, something untouched by the rest of my life. But the thought did not sit right, not anymore. Because leaving now would mean losing something I had not even realized I needed until it was already there. And I exhaled slowly, the cool night air grounding me as I made a decision I could not take back. I do not belong here, I said quietly, not as a dismissal, not as a warning. Just a truth, and Emily nodded once, like she had already come to that conclusion on her own. I figured, she replied, her voice calm, steady. But you keep coming back anyway. And there was no accusation in it. Just curiosity, just a question without a question mark. And I met her eyes, holding that moment without deflecting it, without hiding behind something easier. Because this feels real, I said, the words leaving me before I could reshape them, before I could make them safer, and something shifted in her expression then, not surprise, not disbelief, something softer, something that understood the weight behind that statement. And she looked down briefly, like she was considering what that meant. Not just for me, but for her too. And when she looked back up, there was a quiet clarity in her gaze. Real things are not easy to keep, she said, and the simplicity of that sentence hit harder than anything else had, because it was not dramatic, not exaggerated, just true, and I felt it settle into place, the understanding that whatever this was, it would not stay untouched, it would not stay separate, and I had a choice. Not about whether it would change, but about how, and for the first time in a long time. I did not default to control, I did not calculate outcomes or weigh risks, I just stood there, in the cold night air, with a woman who saw more than she should and did not turn away from it. And I chose something different, something uncertain. Then I will learn how to keep it, I said, my voice quieter now, but steady, and she studied me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether to believe that, whether to trust something she could not see. And then she smiled, small and real, the kind that did not promise anything but did not close the door either. And in that moment, something inside me shifted completely, not fixed, not healed, but changed in a way that mattered, like a direction I had not noticed before had finally come into focus. And as the night settled around us and the city continued its endless movement just a few blocks away, I realized something I had been missing for longer than I could remember. I did not want to escape anymore. I wanted to stay, to build something that did not rely on control or power or distance, something that existed because I chose it, and it chose me back. And for the first time, that felt like enough.